Shifting to the right, far-right parties made gains in the European Parliament elections, seriously threatening mainstream politicians. So what's behind their rise in popularity in Europe, and how could that shape politics on the old continent? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nastasya Tay. Now, European far-right parties made substantial gains in the European Union's parliamentary elections. In France and Germany, parties that were once considered to be on the fringes are now establishing themselves as viable challenges to the establishment. So what's driving this shift? And will these parties be able to turn their successes in these European elections into power at a national level? We'll go to our panel in just a few moments, but first, Fintan Monaghan has this report.
A major breakthrough for Europe's far right. The Alternative for Germany, or AfD party, was among those celebrating their best ever results in European elections.
I think this is a historic result for us in this European election. We've come second, my friends. Super.
France's far right also had much to cheer about. The National Rally won more seats and votes than any of its rivals. It was enough to prompt President Emmanuel Macron to call a snap parliamentary election.
Cette décision est grave, lourde.
This is a serious and weighty decision, but above all, it is an act of trust, confidence in you, my dear compatriots, in the ability of the French people to make the just choice for themselves and for future generations.
Et pour les générations futures.
The rise of Europe's far right has been linked to people struggling with a rising cost of living and growing concerns over immigration. About 300,000 irregular arrivals were recorded in the bloc in 2023. And since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Europe has been hosting more than 6 million Ukrainian refugees. But despite the far right's gains, many of Europe's leaders say support for centrist parties remains strong in the face of challenges from the political extremes.
And this is why the world around us is in turmoil. Forces from the outside and from the inside are trying to destabilize our societies, and they are trying to weaken Europe. We will never let that happen.
While the far right has made major gains, European elections are not national elections. And whether these parties can turn their electoral momentum into political power has yet to be seen. Fintan Monaghan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's now bring in our guests. In Paris, we have Janine de Giovanni. She's a foreign policy analyst and a correspondent. From Oxford in the UK, we have Katy Brown. She's a postdoctoral fellow at Maynooth University. Her research focuses on the far right in France, Italy, Ireland and the UK. A warm welcome to you both. Thanks for joining us on our all-female panel today for now. I'm going to start with you, Katy, because I want to look at the results that we've seen so far and the reaction. I mean, the main headline has been this shift rightwards, but given the expectations of what could have happened, I understand there's also been a fair amount of relief in Brussels, Katy.
Yeah, I think there is a need to be cautious about how we frame these results, because I think a lot of the media coverage has emphasised a shockwave or this huge shift. But I think we need to be careful that we don't overemphasise the magnitude of these results, because it can play into the hands of the far right by hyping their importance. We need to remember that European elections are second-order elections, so that means that there is generally less voter turnout. So even though some of the figures might seem alarming, if we take into account abstention, we get much smaller proportions of the voting population that have voted for the far right. So while, of course, we need to think about the potential dangers that it poses, we also need to account for the fact that many people didn't vote, and so the hyped emphasis on these results can be a little misleading.
Katy, you say a second-order election. I know in these kinds of elections, if voters don't feel that there's necessarily a direct consequence for them in their day-to-day life in terms of national policies, that there might be a bit of a pushback against the incumbent party. So this could have been, in some cases, a bit of a rebuke rather for the left, rather than a vote necessarily for the right. Is that accurate?
I mean, I think we can interpret it as a rebuke potentially of the sort of mainstream politics, because they're failing to kind of offer an alternative in a lot of scenarios, including to the far right. So we've seen mainstream politicians such as Ursula von der Leyen normalizing far right issues through the Pact on Migration and Asylum, for example. So I think we can view this more as a rebuke of the offering that we're seeing in the centre than necessarily this support for the far right.
Sure. Let me bring you in here, Janine, because Katy there is referring to what seems to be almost a mainstreaming of some of the right's agenda over the last few years, particularly, as she mentioned, on migration. And I'm wondering whether that move has potentially contributed to these results. And do you feel that what used to be considered a far-right agenda is now regarded as perhaps more mainstream?
No, I mean, actually, I disagree with it because I'm deeply concerned. I am a European. I also work within the realm of foreign policy, largely in Ukraine. I run an NGO there, a war crimes unit called the Reckoning Project, but also in the Middle East. And I've worked for many years on refugee issues, most notably during the Syrian crisis, which brought so many refugees to Europe, which did trigger so much of the far-right reaction. So for me, I am looking at this through a lens of a globalist. I'm seeing trends of more populist governments. America, I just came back from 3 weeks working in Washington, D.C. I'm deeply, deeply concerned that Trump is now much more of a viable option than he was before. I believe these elections will empower him in many ways, as well as voters in America. But also, I think more importantly, we have to look at something really significant, which is where these votes came from. They came from youth, right? So a lot of it came from young people who don't read newspapers anymore, but they're on TikTok. And Jordan Bardella, the French who has led, Marine Le Pen's successor, is very much a product of TikTok and of Instagram. He's young, he's 28 years old, he's fresh-faced, he has very little political experience. But the votes, the French youth have very much shown that they are tired of establishment. Same in Germany, which is interesting. Everyone thought the far right was going to be crusty kind of skinheads, but it's not. I mean, there was a recent incident on an island in Germany, a wealthy island, where young people were shown singing far-right songs and slogans. So I think we need to look at carefully, where is this coming from? It's also not new, it didn't come out of nowhere. It's been coming for decades. And, 20 years ago in France, in 2004, there were riots on the outskirts of France, which were very much a protest of youth, largely immigrants, children of immigrants from Africa and North Africa, feeling very disenfranchised with society. I think now we are coming into a period where France is extremely vulnerable with the wars both in Ukraine and in Gaza, and perhaps the threat of terrorist attacks. And of course, the Olympic Games coming up 3 weeks after the new vote that Macron has called.
Well, Janine, I want to dig into a little bit of what's happening right now in France. I'll move on to the vote in just a moment, but you mentioned Jordan Bardella, the successor to Marine Le Pen and the National Rally, as you say, 28 years old. He is, I understand, also the son of immigrants. It does feel like in the past few years that what was the National Front, now the National Rally, they've been trying to clean up their image. They've been trying to appeal to a broader audience, and they've also shifted on policies somewhat. How much of a difference has that made?
Absolutely. It's really interesting to see Marine Le Pen, whose father was mirrored in anti-Semitism during the pro-Palestinian rallies, her coming out as a defender of the French Jewish community, which of course is the largest Jewish community in Europe. So this is it's not to say anti-Semitism doesn't exist, of course it does, but that the far right traditionally does take a pro-Israel stance, right? Because it follows Netanyahu, they see him as one of their own, an authoritarian leader who basically uses physical force to crush people. So I think, this whole concept of the old skinheads, neo-Nazis that we had in Europe, say in Sweden, in Germany, in France, 2015, even 10 years ago, is changing. And Jordan Bardella is extremely popular with the youth because people don't read newspapers anymore or even watch. Unfortunately, they're looking at less television. They're on TikTok and they're on Instagram. And Jordan Bardella is a hero in that. He's mastered it. He's come of age with it. So I think it's really important that we take this into account more so now than I think any other election. And as a European, I am deeply concerned about this, and it might not be in this immediate outcome, but I think long-term projection of what will happen in Europe, we are definitely leaning more towards the right.
Well, Katy, let me ask you then about some of the political strategy here, because if we are seeing these shifts in France, I mean, you have to wonder, what is Macron thinking right now with calling this parliamentary snap election? Is this about setting the scene for the 2027 presidential election? Because obviously we know that Jordan Bardella is the successor to Le Pen. Le Pen is saying that if they do well enough, he would be prime minister. So then he would end up in what they're calling a cohabitation government with Macron. I mean, this sounds incredibly awkward for Macron, but also potentially could show whether or not they can govern.
I mean, I think it's kind of a dangerous idea that you should almost test the far right in government to show that they fail to govern well. And I think, again, with Macron, we need to think about his role in all of this, in pushing regressive policies around, for instance, the immigration bill that was passed in January this year. And that was heavily criticized for pandering to the far right. It proposed a limit on access to social security benefits for people coming to the country. You can also think of the ban on wearing the abaya in schools in France. Again, this was pushed by Macron. And that relied, again, on these classic Islamophobic tropes that the far right use, and the idea of secularism within France, which is used to restrict Muslim women's rights. So when we think about Macron's position in terms of the far right and now this decision to hold the election, he risks further normalizing far right politics and giving them another legitimate form of legitimacy through this election. So I think it's a very dangerous position that he's been toying with for a number of years.
Katy, you've talked a little bit about this migration pact, which was approved by the European Parliament back in May. I'm wondering if this is a space that you now see, given the new makeup of the European Parliament, a space for right-leaning parties to push even further. Could we see even more movement there?
Yeah, and I think that is, to be honest, one of the most concerning things about this result. So, of course, it's important that we think about the number of far-right MEPs that we're going to see. But actually, I think it could lend towards this further push and far-right mainstreaming that involves centre-right parties and centre-left parties as well, to some extent. So I think that this is something that we really do need to pay attention to, because the bottom line of it is that this impacts people who are on the sharp end of this politics, whether it's people fleeing persecution, Muslims, LGBTQIA plus communities. So we need to ask what this means for those communities as well, if we see this further shift within the parliament towards mainstreaming.
Yeah. I'm wondering, Janine, in terms of impact on broader European policy too, just how much unity there is within the far right? Because broadly, they seem to campaign, these individual far right parties are campaigning heavily on national issues. So at the European level, you mentioned concerns about the global outlook here in terms of what might happen in Ukraine. And also I'm wondering about in terms of global development and development assistance to the global south. Where do you see those conversations going now as we've seen more seats for the far right at the European level?
So it's interesting. I just came back from Ukraine yesterday. But one thing to keep in mind as well is that, far right, traditionally, they focus on national issues completely. So are they going to be able to put together foreign policy, or are they actually going to be able to work together? Because their whole agenda is really about working for their own country, their own identity. So it will be interesting to see if they actually can have a coordinated effort on policy or on other broader things such as trade. But going back to how they might envision their foreign policy. So we know on Ukraine, it's very split by the far right. The AfD in Germany, of course, is very pro-Russia, as is the PIS party in Poland. In Italy, Giorgia Meloni has been very pro-Ukrainian, but there are other parties in Italy which are not. Hungary, of course, led by Orban, is extremely pro-Putin. Now, Ukraine right now, and having just gotten back, is in a very vulnerable position. They were waiting for a long time for the bill to go through Congress, U.S. Congress, to get them more ammunition and more aid. On the front lines, they're really struggling. People have gone through, this is the third year of war, so people are really enduring a kind of deep psychological fatigue, as well as, even in Kyiv, air raids at night, which keep people awake and keep them always anxious. So it's very important to see if the really, I felt, extraordinary European consensus that was behind Ukraine until now will hold. Traditionally, the far right, it is something that's beyond their borders. So therefore, they don't have the same kind of impact there. As for Israel and the war in Gaza, the far right traditionally has backed Netanyahu. So that again is troubling, as is what they might do if Trump does get in, who has said basically he'll annex the West Bank and fully support, give Netanyahu an even more green light to do whatever he wants.
I'm interested in what appears to have been a shift within the far right itself in Europe, because we're now talking about trying to form some kind of coherent policy, be it domestic, European-wide or foreign. But previously, it seemed to be much of the conversation was actually driven by wanting to break away from Europe. And that narrative has changed. So, Katy, let me bring you in on this. I'm wondering how you see this newfound power by the far right being manifested in the bloc going forward.
Well, I think there's an interesting contradiction a lot of the time in far-right politics towards Europe. So, as you mentioned, there's often a kind of Eurosceptic view of the European Parliament, but they also quite often rely on what Martha Lorimer calls using Europe as an ideological resource. So they are also kind of feeding into ideas of European identity. So I feel like that is where they could sort of expand their nationalist politics to this European level. I did some research on far-right discourse around Turkish accession, and they relied heavily on this idea of European white identity, pushing against the accession of Turkey on that basis. So I think that these nationalist discourses and racist discourses are often then translated onto this European level too. So that's where they could kind of find more common ground between their different nationalist policies.
Well, Janine, let me ask you then what you think this all means for the debate that's ongoing about EU enlargement.
So mainly I'm thinking about Ukraine, because working so closely in Ukraine, working inside Ukraine, my friends, my colleagues want to join Europe. They feel they deserve to join Europe. They believe that they have been fighting a war for Europe. they don't see fighting. I mean, of course, they're fighting for their country, but they also see themselves as holding the last line of democracy against Putin, who was antagonized by the expansion of NATO, but also has made it very clear of what he wants. So Ukraine has been waiting patiently to join the EU. And if the far right does get in, it's pretty doubtful they will, or that it would take an extended period of time. And that would be deeply disappointing, especially for the Ukrainians that really have been losing their lives, suffering terribly. And in many ways, what they see as fighting a war to keep democracy in Europe.
I want to ask you both about another huge issue that's been on the table for the EU for some time, and that's climate policy. For so many years, Europe has been a real leader in this area. But we have seen in the past few months, certainly very visible farming protests, for instance, on the streets of many capital cities. And there has been an argument that has also contributed to the results that we've seen in this election. Katy, do you think that we might see a shift at all in EU climate policy? It felt like there was a consensus on this for some time, but does that still exist?
I mean, I think it's emblematic of some of the processes that we were talking about earlier in this conversation, where the mainstream parties are shifting their policies from more progressive positions towards more regressive ones. And I think with the increased power of the far right within the European Parliament, the prospects for that topic of climate policy are not looking promising again.
Janine, do you see this as pushback from marginalised groups or groups that feel that they haven't been listened to enough when it comes to broader European policy here? For instance, the farmers that we've been hearing from. And could we then see what we're now seeing at the European level be replicated at a national level?
Yeah, I do. I do think this is very much a vote that signifies disenfranchised people, dissatisfied people. And in France, you saw it over the past few years from protests, whether it was the yellow vests or the farmers. Even in some way, you could even link the pro-Palestinian. People are dissatisfied, and that brings in a lot of issues, climate change being one of them, youth feeling that they are on the outskirts of society, a desire to get rid of globalization. And it's very interesting, the language that Macron and his team are using now about the dissolution of the National Assembly and the call for the snap elections. They're framing it in a way which is very clever. They're saying, we are a republic. We believe in democracy. We believe in the people. We love the French people. Therefore, we are turning this vote back to you. And, we know this is a massive gamble from Macron, but in many ways, it's more than a gamble. It could be Russian roulette, because he's basically trusting enough that the voters will vote against the far right. But it could very easily go the other way.
I wonder how much that changes the level of influence very powerful leaders in powerful countries like France and Germany have at the European level now. So if other parliamentarians, Janine, are aware that both Macron and Scholz are struggling at home, does this change the level of influence they have on big policy decisions at the European parliamentary level going ahead? Does this create the space for more influence from countries like Italy and Maloney, for instance?
I think it depends what happens. I think at the moment, for the next 3 weeks, we're basically in a state of limbo and perhaps shock. I think more than anything, there was, even though, as I said, this didn't happen in a vacuum. It's been building up for some time. It's been building up for decades. But at the same time, one never really wants to believe. It's the same as I woke up in 2016 and Donald Trump was suddenly elected. No one believed it would happen. Brexit. I went to bed, I woke up and there was Brexit. So I think it had a similar psychological effect. Whether or not that can be what will happen in Brussels, I think we have to wait for the next 3 weeks to see how the snap elections go.
Well, there are the elections in France, but there's also potentially another election that would be critical for the European Union, and that would be for Ursula von der Leyen's job. So, Katy, let me ask you, does she keep her job come July?
I mean, it's hard to make predictions on that, but I think she also, in the build-up to this, emphasised that she was open to collaborating with far-right groups, such as Giorgia Meloni and Fratelli d'Italia. So I think it'll be very interesting to see how this progresses. But I think that there is a good chance that she could, and that is also very worrying for the direction of travel within EU politics.
When you talk about that direction of travel, Katy, how realistic do you see being the rise of a far-right supergroup, so to speak, within European politics?
Again, I think we can sort of temper those kinds of ideas by, of course, being worried about the idea of a far-right group taking power. But really what we've seen is this centre-right politics, normalising far-right politics. And I think that that's where we need to focus our attention. The likelihood of a far-right supergroup is very limited, but the impacts of normalized far-right politics is very real for those at the sharp end. So I think that's where we need to focus our attention and try to combat the creeping normalization of these ideas and policies.
When we talk about the normalization of these ideas, Janine, I'm going to ask you just very briefly to end here, to put this in context for us, in the global context. When we see these trends in Europe, when you talk about the possibility of Donald Trump being re-elected for a second time, where do you see the global trend in terms of populist politics going right now?
I think there's two things. I think first there's the media, which has had a massive effect on it, the spread of disinformation, the rise of right-wing shock jocks, and really, in a way, a kind of indoctrination of younger people into a way of thinking which is either black or white. There's very little, in some ways, ability to interpret gray area. So I think that's really dangerous. I also think there is dissatisfaction with elite leaders, with what is seen as globalization throughout the world, and basically wanting to see another path. Unfortunately, the far right has managed to establish themselves in some ways friendlier, fresher faces. Jordan Bardella, or even Marine Le Pen herself, who has really separated herself from her father's policies. So this, in a way, this rebranding of the new right and attracting younger voters is, I think, something we have to take extremely seriously.
And it's something we'll continue watching very closely indeed. Thank you to both of our guests, Janine de Giovanni and Katy Brown, and thank you too for watching. Remember, you can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Remember, you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasya Tay, and the whole team here in Doha. Bye for now.